I want to say before I start that I think Hamilton's mythology is a cool cultural artifact. It's interesting to me that while most forms of literary canon have dissolved from our collective consciousness, there is still this one book that most adolescents in the United States read at least part of, and can still be referenced in other works of literature, like Salvage the Bones, without major concern for whether the audience will recognize it. However, I also think the way that Hamilton's mythology depicts its characters and narrative may contribute negatively to the way that this tradition is passed down to us. What are the gods? It always felt in middle school like the gods of Greek mythology were individual people, i.e. human-like entities who just happen to never die and have magic powers. But going back to actual Greek literature, it is the primary sources, if you will, it is apparent that this was not how they saw their gods. Hello. Fucking up my take. Yeah? These primary sources, the gods feel like the personification of natural forces, personifications whose identities and relationships to one another are the creation of the individual artist. Being forces of nature, they are unrelated to human standards of morality, both because, one, their actions in myth need not be interpreted literally, and two, because they are inhuman beings. We see them as people. The inequality between the treatment of incest as it occurs among the Olympians and the way it occurs among Thebans seems unfair. If we imagine these as uncountable, unknowable cosmic entities who touch human life from a foreign position, the unequal hierarchy of the Greek myth world starts to make a little bit more sense. And I think these two elements are what the manner of presentation in Hamilton's mythology fails to capture. To blame it all on Edith Hamilton is unfair, though. My gripe is with the whole way that Greek myth is taught to us. In my experience, the corpus of Hellenic literature is treated as capital, a pile of symbols or motifs to be learned either to compose one's own culturally affiliated works or in order to crack the code of modern European literature. Basically, the point and focus of knowing who Persephone is so that you can then recognize that narrative capital when you read Sylvia Plath's Two Sisters of Persephone later on. And because we fail to treat this literary tradition as anything more than material to be reimagined by modern writers, we fail to acknowledge that it, and by it I mean the individual people who created it, might have something to say about life, or morality, or the world around them, something that might still be salient to our lives today. Because we don't discuss the environment in which these texts were originally composed and consumed, we neglect the nature of oral poetry and the way that the Greeks also would have used their legends and gods as a malleable tool for sculpting artistic and existential ideas. Let's do a case study, the castration myth. Kronos' coup against his father Uranos, as related by Hesiod in his Theogony. Uranos is the personification of the sky. His name is just the word sky in Greek, and if we don't acknowledge this, we might assume the two to be distinct entities. Instead, the male god who roamed the barren earth in massive human form and the literal dome of oxygen which superimposes our world are the same thing in Greek myth. Gaia, whose name is similarly just the word earth, commissions her son Kronos to overthrow Uranos because, according to the Theogony, Uranos used to stuff all his children back into the hollow of earth as soon as they were born, keeping them from light, and vast earth groaned under the pressure inside. But Uranos isn't just a divine figure, he is an inextricable element of the structure of the universe, so Kronos can't kill him, he can't even remove him. So Hesiod borrows a narrative motif from the oral tradition of nearby parts of Asia and has Kronos castrate his father. Uranos' testicles are tossed into the ocean, creating Aphrodite, but after that Uranos is never mentioned again as a conscious being with agency, not just in the Theogony, but in the full body of Hellenic literature. What does that say about the ancient Greek understanding of impotence? When Uranos is castrated, he loses the person-like part of himself, the part that walked the earth as a corporal individual. Now he becomes exclusively that passive element of the structure of the universe, making room for the world as created by the Titans. In Hesiod's other poem, Works and Days, we learn a little bit about the world that the Titans preside over. While it's not entirely like our human world, it does bear some important similarities, including the presence of living things, something that was impossible in Uranus' anti-birth regime, and it also features the passage of time with seasons and death. That's to be expected. Before Kronos took the throne from Uranus, time didn't exist. This text is from a slightly different religious tradition, but in the Orphic Hymn to Kronos, the Titan is described as the father of vast eternity, who puts the world immense in the everlasting chains of time. And thus, we can understand that the Titan's coup isn't just a regime change, it is a dramatic alteration of the fabric of the world itself. Back to Aphrodite real quick. She's one of the more common examples of how different versions of a myth will have different explanations or details about the same phenomenon. Specifically, there are differing accounts of the birth of Aphrodite. Homer tells us she is a daughter of Zeus, Others, like Hesiod's, say that she emerges from the sea foam kicked up by Uranus's testicles falling into the ocean. If you were, say, a curious 6th grader and asked why these differing accounts exist, you may have been told that these myths are compiled from geographically different communities, and that at some point the massive game of telephone played by Hellenic societies over the course of thousands of years generated different versions of the story. And while that's true, this answer fails to give attention to the artistic creativity of the individual poet. Hesiod doesn't use the seafoam version of Aphrodite's birth because he hasn't heard the other versions. It's because he's trying to compose a poem that describes the origin of the world, and he can't logically describe the fertility of the gods that come after Zeus's coup without the literal incarnation of fertility being born first. This isn't a genealogical science, it's an artist arranging the themes of their story to suit the intentions of their work. So Hesiod's account, in summary, goes like this. The sky is selfish, saving the earth only for himself and not allowing anything else to come into existence. The earth, resentful, produces offspring and sends them to strip the sky of its selfhood, beginning time and making the process of creation, especially the creation of living things, possible. This is a narrative of the prehistoric turbulence that ends with Zeus's ascent to masterhood of the universe, but it is also an articulation of philosophy, specifically the philosophy of how the physical and abstract world are structured and interrelated. And I think when we talk about Greek mythology, it's much more compelling to ask ourselves why Hesiod might have thought this way about the world, if we agree with him, or what other ideas about the world might follow from the philosophy presented in the Theogony. By treating this body of literature as exclusively artistic capital to be used by later traditions, by teaching students to see this as the uninteresting grunt work which precedes the analysis of more relevant literature, we limit our ability to ask these questions. And when we do this in the context of schools, we lose at least one opportunity for young people, often asking existential questions on their own anyway, to engage with not the answers, but an answer. So Robert Fagles, who I think is a great translator, and who based off interviews I've heard really lived and breathed the work that he translated, once said in an interview that he thinks that the Homeric epics should be taught. I think it was like certainly in English and maybe even in the original Greek, which I can respect the love, man, but that seems maybe wildly unnecessary. I just want to say that my point is not that we don't value classical literature enough, or that we should, focus more intently on the Western canon of literature in our education system, because like that's super problematic. But I just mean that when we are teaching classical literature during the time allotted to that already in school, we should adjust our approach to be more conscious of the creative intent and themes of those works on their own. It's not like a morally dire problem, but I just think that more kids would get more out of the time that they spend with Homer or Hesiod if it was taught this way.